So is there an argument for having dedicated load balancers just for your object storage, or should you just use the load balancers that you've already got?
Well, okay. So in my opinion, this depends entirely upon who's owning that object storage platform, right? If it's a customer, if I'm running my own object storage platform, I've already got load balancer, and I've got complete control over it, and I'm responsible for the uptime of the object storage platform, then fair enough. There's an argument to say I could use a load balancer that I've already got. But that load balancer might be doing more than one thing. It might be doing, at 10 o'clock every night, it's doing beam backup, right? But it just so happens
the object storage anyway.
Well, so if it's going through a load balancer, it could be beam backup, could be going off to object storage. It might be going to its own SAN. It might be going off site to another data center. It might be going wherever, right? Ultimately, if there's another load that's going through the load balancer at the same time, we call it noisy neighbour, right? Where effectively we've got another service pulling resources and drain on the load balancer, and that's having an impact potentially on the throughput of the load balancer to the object storage platform. So if we're talking about the object storage provider, if I was an object storage provider, I'd be absolutely freaking out and panicking if my customer said to me, "Can I carry on using my load balancers?" Because as an object storage provider, I've got a commitment to a certain SLA, a certain uptime, certain throughput. And the problem I'd have with that is that if I allow my customer to be the front entry door point into my object storage platform, and then they go and do a load of crazy stuff on their load balancer, then my SLAs and my performance metrics are not going to be valid. I might be able to achieve that on a storage platform, but the customer's the entry point, and it's going to muck that up.
See, that's really interesting to me on the sales side, because I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, right, what do I do for a living? I sell load balancers, right? Of course, I'm going to say you need dedicated load balancers.
Of course.
Why would you need anything else?
Yeah,
It'd be crazy to tell you don't.
Yeah.
But it's actually really interesting to hear it in those terms, that it's not only about the customer getting the right level of performance, it's also actually about protecting the storage vendor themselves, because as you just said, and I spent some time working in the storage space, so I know a lot of the time when you're selling storage to enterprises, the requirements are around a certain amount of capacity and throughput and performance. And if you don't live up to those promised metrics, you're in a world of pain. You either misset expectations or you upset the customer. Worst of all, they end up having to spend more money. So it's
but you also end up as the vendor who's then having to prove that it's the customer's load balancer that's at fault rather than their own equipment. So it's horrible.
Implementations, I guess, of object storage come with their own switches. That's been my experience anyway, right?
So
most of those.
I mean, it depends. You're right. It depends on the vendor. Generally, they've got a preferred provider around switching and around the networking piece.
So it'd be dedicated for that, and the same should be for load balancers.
I think you're right. Load balancer is another piece of networking equipment.
It's definitely true for SAN environments. You would, if you were putting in a new SAN environment, you would normally put in some kind of fibre switching as part of that. Is it a little bit less common?
Object storage, because it's running over the network, what we typically would see is object storage areas being VLAN'd off, being carved off, something like that. If there's communication between the back-end storage nodes, I'd expect the storage vendor to want to put their own equipment in to run that. But it's the point that it breaks out into the customer's network that suddenly you have a question over, do you control that switching? But it goes back to the customer having control of the load balancer and the active network, or the vendor having control of that active network. Typically in the customer's environment, it's going to be the networking level is sat with the customer. But I personally think you need to have it there as a storage vendor. You need to be dishing your own appliances.
We all know what change brings, right? Because, I've done enough sessions or CADs or whatever you want to call it to discuss changes, especially around, load balancers at the time. And it is very problematic, because if something does go wrong, even though you've got two there, something goes wrong in that change window, that's a potential for your backup not to run, or whatever it is not to run. So, it can cause all sorts of issues. So you're right, and it's the same for me when I look at load balancing anyway, that I don't like to mix my internal and external load balancers. So if I've got GSLB running on the outside, I like to keep that on the outside, and I like to keep my internal traffic
inside.
inside.
Yeah.
On separate internal load balancers.
We've lapsed into talking about load balancers because that's what we do. I think we were mainly object storage, and we've fallen into our own.
Yeah, we have.
I think we've actually covered the fundamentals, the basics of object there. So should we call it a day for now?
I think we
On to the
can.
next
I think-
next subject.
Yeah, I think we
I think
can.
it's lunchtime.